speakers are Donna Hileton, Claire DeRoche, and Leah Horowitz or Michael Kumar.
Good afternoon, Ms. Donna Hilton. Thank you for having me. I want to mirror some of the conversations that you've heard today. I am a community health advocate for the Coming Home program at St. Luke's Morningside Hospital, and I work in a program that works with people transitioning out of prisons and jails and that have been directly affected by the criminal justice system. And so I speak to my story. I also have been directly affected within the criminal justice system. I spent 27 years, and I went through Rikers Island, and I also spent the majority of my time, obviously, in Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. Throughout that time, I served some years within solitary confinement, and mostly over half of my time on Rikers Island within solitary confinement unit. First, I was placed into it as protective custody. What differentiated protective custody from segregated housing unit, or ESH as it is called now, will be called now, or a punitive segregated unit, was just a status that I was labeled as depending on whatever happened, whatever week, whatever day. And I'm being very serious when I say this. I went in under protective custody due to the nature of my crime and the high profile of my crime. And I went to court one day, I came back, and it's amazing to me that 30 years later that the scalpel thing is still an issue, because I came back and supposedly there was a straight razor type scalpel in my cell that was found, and from that I received an infraction that warranted me to have, and I was told, take it or it would be a problem. Okay, so I took the consequences of the infraction and was placed, which was a cell immediately across from where I was in the same unit, because there was no differentiation of units, just the name, the labeling. And so with that, I watched what was going on around me, and I said, something is wrong here. What is wrong? Something is wrong. I don't like it. I don't like what it stands for. Something is wrong. And as I went throughout the system, I realized that they're all the same thing. And what was missing was that I was placed into a system through my own accord, but I was still placed in a system that said it was supposed to rehabilitate, to change, to help enhance myself, to grow, to become a productive member of society. And I said it was doing neither of any of nothing like that. And so I said, what could I do as an individual, as a human being, as a person to correct that? So what I did was to help create programs while I was inside, while I was incarcerated, to become the person that I knew I was, and not the person that society or the system said that I was. And so through that, we created the college program, a family violence program that dealt with the abuse that people, especially women, but definitely also men, were going throughout their lives, especially people of color, have been subjected to, and so also have become more subjected to it when they go through the system. And I said, this has got to stop. And so we created also a health program, the ACE program, that dealt with the virus. We know that the virus was a problem within the system, and it continues to be, and so many other issues. And so I became a co-creator of those programs and continue to do that to this day, because that's what's wrong. We look to penalize and criminalize behavior instead of try to change the behavior and say what's wrong, what can we as a society, as a human race, do to change and to enhance, to make it better, instead of penalize and to demoralize and to just criminalize behavior and people. We can change this. The very fact that we're even having a hearing of this magnitude today in almost 2015, and I'm going back all the way to 1985, is saying something. We have not progressed in any way. This is the only country that wants to address behavior by penalizing it instead of looking at the problem. We Band-Aid it, and on the Band-Aids we put things that causes more problems. It doesn't address it, it doesn't fix it, it doesn't bring up any kind of solutions. And so people like us who have been directly affected by it are telling you it doesn't work. That young man he was a product of all that abuse. I was subjected to abuse while I was in solitary confinement, and when I wasn't. But I didn't allow it to tear me down. I said something had to change. And so I decided to create programs to change it, and I was allowed to do that. But then everyone has had that ability or had that help. So that's why I came to speak as I am today, because if we're having these hearings, that means we know something is wrong. We don't have to really figure out what to do to change it. We've been on this road for a long time. We need to stop criminalizing behavior and really change our own. That's how it'll change.
Thank you, Ms. Hart.
Thank you.
Claire DeRose, followed by Leah Horowitz, or by Paul Kumar, and then Dr. Drucker.
Good afternoon. My name is Leah Horowitz. I'm a criminal defense attorney at the Bronx Defenders. I'm also a member of JAC. I will be brief and stand in support of so many of the other advocates who have spoken. But the main reason why I'm here is I've had so many clients who have been in solitary confinement, and I have literally watched them unravel before my eyes, from visit to visit, from week to week. I have seen my clients be desperate for an out, begging for relief from the torture that is confinement, and the wide stream and deepening effects that it has on someone's psyche and their experience. There are incredibly troubling parts of ESH. One of them, as I see it, is the criteria number 5, which I believe is incredibly overbroad. My experience has shown me that allowing that sort of overbroad criteria will allow for corrections officers to label people who have fallen out of favor with corrections officer, and will subject them to being placed in this incredibly restrictive unit without any basis or cause. And it's connected to that, the lack of due process. The almost complete lack of due process that we see in the hearings as related to solitary confinement, I believe, would also be problematic in this. Without any impartial judge or independent advocates, I don't believe that people who go through this process have any fair shot in terms of contesting these charges that are against them, and are often facing such dramatic and torturous sanctions that there has to be a better process in place. And just to note also, in terms of the contact visits, I have had clients who, as desperate as they are in solitary confinement, one of their main concerns is the inability to have contact visits, particularly with their children, and how particularly important it is for a young child to be able to have that interaction with their parent, and the lack of that has such a dramatic effect on that relationship. And I would also note that I've had so many clients who are in solitary confinement who have absolutely zero access to any sort of stimulation, any sort of books, or anything of that nature, which is why I think it's especially important to not limit or restrict further the ability for packages and reading materials and that sort of thing to come to people. So I have so many different concerns with ESH, but those are just a couple of them. I would ask the board to reject this as just another form of solitary confinement. Thank you.
Sure. Right.
Yes, thank you so much. As we know, 85% of the people out at Rikers are pre-trial detainees, so
Yes.
they're awaiting trial. My question to you as a criminal defense attorney who represents these inmates who are in pre-trial detention and then transferred to punitive segregation, have you seen that their stay in punitive segregation has affected the inmates' ability to aid you in their defense and to assert their right to trial and their presumption of innocence?
Most certainly. And I would say, just to begin with, that often I have clients who become, when they are put in solitary confinement, become more concerned with their placement there than their criminal case and what they're potentially facing in terms of that. So it becomes a situation of desperation. I've had clients who are become much more interested in sort of plea bargains that might send them upstate, that could potentially get them out of solitary at Rikers. Everything sort of changes. And I think that that level of desperation that exists completely changes also my client's ability to sort of think clearly and plan accordingly, and to work with me in a reasonable and logical way, because they're in such an awful, desperate situation. And I think it affects it in so many ways. And I would also just note that, given that, the protections the due process protections that are in place in criminal court are obviously incredibly significant, and to not have that when someone is facing something as dramatic as solitary confinement, as I said, which is often more significant to my clients, I think that's incredibly problematic and should cause us pause. Thank you.
Now we'll hear from Dr. Drucker, followed by Barry Campbell and Elizabeth Mayers.
Thank you to the board for the opportunity to speak to you here. As you said before, you're in a very important position at this moment in your lives around this issue. And I want to speak to that a bit as a public health professional, as a psychologist. I'm a clinical psychologist licensed in New York. I worked at Montefiore Einstein for 40 years, part of which involved Rikers Island as a program. Dr. Cohen was medical director when I was there. And since then, I'm at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I'm the head of a program called From Punishment to Public Health, which is an attempt to bridge many of these issues in the wider conception and practice of both public health and criminal justice. When we look at issues like violence, they're inseparable. And what's going on here is a discussion of an environment that's being created, it has been created, has evolved at Rikers Island over the years, that involves both of these things in a way that we're trying to put a cap on, but without questioning the commitment to punishment, which is the underlying basis of everything that goes on in the criminal justice system that has abdicated responsibilities about recovery, rehabilitation. It gets very hard to do that. The violence, a worsening culture of violence, which is the term that's been used in the lawsuit that's being brought by the U.S. Attorney, can be seen in the rise of violence against correction officers, against inmates. This is very much a shared environment that both correction officers and inmates have to live with. And we know from data, national data, about rates of mental illness and suicide and child problems among correction officers, that they're very much party to the same environment and the damages those environments cause. So how do we address this culture of violence? Well, in a public health model, it's about prevention, not about treatment. And the primary issue of prevention is to make this thing smaller, to get it back to the size that other countries in the world have. We have 700 people per 100,000 in prison in this country, compared to the European Union countries, which have only about 100 per 100,000, and even down as low as 50. Even though crime has dropped dramatically in this country in the last 10 years, the prison system maintains itself at 2 million people behind bars, another 6 or 7 million who are hovering in the background, going in and out of prison over their lifetimes, a lifetime effect. And the way to address that is, especially at the young end, is to begin to raise the age of criminal responsibility. New York is only one of 2 states, the other being North Carolina, that puts people in prison at age 16 and 17, and so much of what we're hearing about today is about that adolescent population. But the kinds of atrocities that arise in this, the use of the term torture, and the unfortunate use of using that word enhance, which in the normal world means better, but in interrogation techniques means less, and I think in this situation also means less, because it means more of the same philosophies that have been shown to fail. Robert Lifton, a great hero of mine who I studied under, has a piece of the Times the other day about the Nazi doctors and torture, and he makes a very important point, which has nothing to do with Nazism, but does have to do with the responsibilities of health and medical professionals. He says the power of what I call atrocity-producing situations, where policies dictated from above create psychological environment to which ordinary people are capable of committing atrocities. And we all have to be very, very mindful of that as we go along with these institutions, as we have for the last 35 years, which have turned into an international disgrace. Everyone in the world understands what's going on in the United States, except the people in the United States. And it's a source of shame for a country I'm otherwise generally proud of. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Barry Campbell, followed by Elizabeth Mayers, and then Riley Doyle Evans.
Good afternoon. My name is Barry Campbell, and I'm here representing the Fortune Society and the JACS Coalition. I've been associated with the Fortune Society since 1991. I'm also formerly incarcerated. My last vacation on the Rikers Island Resort was in 2003, so I'm not that far removed. I will say this. I'm not going to read from my testimony today because everybody's heard all of the great points and all of the issues that need to be brought to the table. I will say this much. The people that are being held on Rikers Island, whether they're sentenced or whether they're detained, they are human beings. And that is the first and foremost thing that we need to understand and recognize, is that they're human beings. And if you take a look at me today, I'm not the picture of somebody who should be sitting on Rikers Island. Most people think that when they see me. I do a lot of work with the 16 to 26-year-olds after Rikers Island. The threat of danger, the threat of violence is real. Make no mistake about it. And I'm not trying to downplay that. But there is a certain level of passion that you bring to the work that I do that cuts through all of that. There's an identification process that cuts through all of that. There's a role modeling process that cuts through all of that. For them to look at me and know that I'm somebody from the $1 million blocks that fuel the state prison system, to know that I'm somebody that committed multiple crimes, I'm a persistent predicate, for them to look at me and know today that I'm a tax-paying citizen who walks the streets of New York without looking over my shoulder, and I have no fear of the police, none whatsoever, because I know what I'm doing is absolutely correct, and I know what the other side of the track looks like. I think the most important thing that people need to remember when they do these enhanced supervision units and segregation is that you're treating a human being like an animal. And 90% of us are coming home. And when I come home, I'm going to come home and behave like an animal because that's all I've known. And then you look at me and you want to condemn me for that behavior. I'm not saying it's wrong. But what I am saying is the way that you're treating people is incorrect. You cannot treat a human being like that and expect positive results. It just can't be done. It just can't be done. And the only positive results that I got while I was incarcerated was from other inmates. I picked and chose who I wanted to listen to. I knew what garbage was, and I knew what bad behavior was. And my time on Rikers Island was spent in bad behavior. And I understand that there has to be consequences for your behavior. But this city, this state is ripe right now to sit down at the collective bargaining table with the people that you're talking about, people of color, such as myself, the policymakers, such as yourself, the correction officers, and sit down at the table and figure out a way to handle this problem. Because if it's one thing that we all know, is that society and humanity is better served when we all have a healthy dialogue about something. Not one person saying, I have the power and this is the way it's going to be, but a healthy dialogue about something, and that there is compromise. And we will come up with a great solution. But that great solution is not going to come from one side of the fence or the other. It has to be done collectively. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next speaker is Ms. Mayers, followed by Riley Doyle Evans, and then Nick Lilino-Oski.
I guess it's good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Absolutely. Good afternoon.
My name is Elizabeth Mayers, and I'm a member of the Jails Action Coalition. I guess I should do this. The Department of Correction insists that enhanced supervision housing is non-punitive, and the euphemism in its title, enhanced, would imply that it is a good thing. I am surprised that the department would think of using the term enhanced at this moment in time as a means of offering safety to incarcerated people and corrections officers. I would submit that it is misguided in many ways and once again leaves unaddressed the use of solitary confinement in the Rikers jails. I have been a visitor to Rikers for 4 years, since the time when my friend's son, who was mentally ill, was incarcerated at 17 years old. He is still there. During that time, he spent months and months in solitary confinement. I was pleased that for 15 months, the Board of Correction had been reviewing this issue of solitary, euphemistically known as punitive segregation, with a view to making recommendations for new, more humane rules related to this practice. However, all of this work went by the wayside when the Department of Correction introduced the enhanced supervision housing units just several weeks ago, maybe 2 months. There are numerous punitive aspects of this new enhancement, which others have and will describe. My experience is as a visitor, and I will only speak about the visit restrictions. In his October 22nd letter to Mr. Gordon Campbell, Commissioner Pott wrote that persons incarcerated in the enhanced housing units will be restricted to non-contact visits. Fortunately for me, if this young man is placed in the new housing units, I will be permitted to visit him since I do not have a relevant criminal history. However, I would not be allowed to give a hug to my friend's son because I might be carrying contraband. Having been searched 3 times, including having to shake out my bra and fold down my pants, I think this is not highly likely. Nor would it be likely that the mothers and babies I see on the Q100 bus would be carrying contraband unless contraband includes the obvious affection that a hug conveys. No matter what the history of infractions, I am convinced that a loving embrace has the power to be therapeutic and to remind someone of what he is missing being inside this setting. It is for this reason that I have spoken against this aspect of the visitor restrictions. It seems highly punitive not to allow an incarcerated person to be touched by his mother, baby, or, as in my case, a friend who has known him since he was born. And I just want to say I've listened to the explanations for the no-contact visits. On the one hand, people might be hiding scalpels. On the other hand, it's something that will allow you to give people the opportunity to get that when they're acting better. So I don't know how those two things work together. I would suggest that the Department of Corrections, in addition to the wonderful addition of video cameras, get some kind of scanning machines that can find if you have scalpels. Because, as I say, I went through, it's an hour and a half before you get to see the person you're visiting. And yet, that doesn't work. So I thank you for this opportunity to talk to all of you.
Thank you, Ms. Myers. Riley Doyle Evans, Nick Malinowski, and then Professor Alex Reinhardt, followed by Christine Joplin.
Good afternoon. I just want to start by acknowledging the tremendous courage that it takes to have an incarcerated person come up here and recount the trauma that they've lived at Rikers Island and federal prison and state prison, and I think it's really tragic that more than half the board has missed some of those important voices. My name is Riley Doyle Evans, and I come before you today to testify on behalf of Brooklyn Defender Services and to share some of the stories of the more than 6,000 people we represent who will pass through the city jail system each year. As jail services coordinator for BDS, I work with hundreds of our clients on a whole range of issues, from their criminal and immigration cases to their conditions of confinement, their safety, and their medical and mental health care concerns. These clients come to Rikers Island as innocent New Yorkers under the law, held there mostly because they're too poor to pay bail. Brooklyn Defender Services shares the concern of the department, the board, and others about the violence on Rikers Island. I'm often the first person to visit a client after they've been stabbed, slashed, or burned by another incarcerated person, or severely beaten by staff. However, our deep concern about the well-being of our clients does not lead us to support the creation of overly inclusive, highly restrictive housing units where our clients' rights will be violated. At its core, the proposed ESH unit is about providing the Department of Correction with more discretion. It has been well documented by this board, by the Department of Justice, by the city's Department of Investigation, and by many others, the myriad ways DOC has already misused discretion and failed to abide by the minimum standards. Others have detailed the grave concerns with the contours of this proposed rule. In my testimony, I'd like to offer a few brief stories from clients I have met with at Rikers. The voices of incarcerated people, I fear, will be conspicuously underrepresented in this conversation, not least because notices about this hearing and the rule change were not visibly posted in the jails, and the few that went up were only seen this week. Mr. M. Mr. M was housed at OBCC when a guard alleged that he witnessed Mr. M hide something in a body cavity. In response, Mr. M was the victim of a violent cell search and cell extraction. Despite no contraband being found during the search or in an x-ray, Mr. M was placed in a contraband watch cell where he was supposed to stay for as long as 72 hours. Mr. M was not hiding anything and no contraband was discovered. Mr. M was left in the contraband watch cell, a room the size of a bathroom, with a toilet that could not flush, for 8 days. During these 8 days, Mr. M was denied access to any and all privileges. He was in a cell with nothing but his own waste for 24 hours a day for more than a week. We were alerted to Mr. M by his mother only because she had not heard from him. He had not called in several days because he had not had access to a phone. Mr. M informed us that there were several other people in the unit who had been in contraband watch cells for weeks. Despite not recovering any contraband from Mr. M, he was found guilty by a hearing officer of disobeying a direct order and issued 20 days of solitary confinement. A patently unjust abuse of discretion. The 8 days Mr. M spent in the contraband watch cell without a shower did not count toward those 20 days of punitive segregation. During his subsequent sentence in the CPSU, Mr. M and others begged for staff to give them toilet tissue and were told in response, "Use your hand." Mr. A was housed in protective custody and was harassed throughout his stay in the PC unit. Mr. A was disliked by a staff member there who targeted him for searches, physically assaulted him, and eventually made an allegation against Mr. A based on confidential information and issued an infraction against him. Mr. A was moved to the CPSU prior to receiving a hearing for his nonviolent infraction. During his escort, staff rushed him through a corridor, causing him to slip and fall, injuring his hip and leg, and he now walks with a cane. Because of the evidence against Mr. A was confidential, he was unable to mount any significant defense. Who could he call as a witness? What documents could he possibly request to make an argument? Naturally, Mr. A was found guilty of this nonviolent offense, and he was issued 90 days in punitive segregation. Mr. S. Mr. S is a young person who suffers from schizoaffective disorder and a learning disorder. During his incarceration, Mr. S was the victim of stabbing and slashing attacks and burning attacks when he resisted pressure to join gangs. When staff failed to de-escalate conflicts with Mr. S over things like lost property, he was issued infractions for disobeying orders, and he was eventually placed in the RHU. The isolation endured by Mr. S contributed to his decompensation, and he began to experience more regular auditory and visual hallucinations. Mr. S became increasingly depressed and hopeless while in the RHU. At one point, he shared his sense of hopelessness with staff, and in response, he was placed on suicide watch in an empty cell with nothing more than a smock. After coming off suicide watch, Mr. S was denied all out-of-cell time and access to privileges he had earned through program compliance for the next 3 weeks. In short, staff's response to a perceived suicidal statement was to isolate Mr. S entirely, 24 hours a day, in his cell for a month. Mr. S discharged to the community directly from isolation. In an opaque system, these stories are not unique. Rules are ignored, people are abandoned, discretion is abused, and human beings suffer. As you consider whether to give this department more discretion, I implore you to consider the lived experiences of New Yorkers in city jails. New Yorkers still innocent in the eyes of the law who are simply too poor to pay bail. Consider not only the stories I've described, think about the daily life for the human beings who would be housed in enhanced supervision housing. Consider what it means to be escorted with an officer with your hands behind your back in handcuffs anytime you move. Imagine being strip searched by an officer every time you go to see a doctor or go to social services.
Mr. Evans, I'm going to have to say thank you.
Last sentence, please. Imagine your only contact with your family being separated by a thick pane of filthy plexiglass. Imagine being locked in your bathroom 17 hours a day.
The next speaker is Professor Weiner, followed by Christine Japley, followed by Gail Wiener.
Good afternoon. Thanks for y'all's patience and the patience of everyone who's still in this room. My name is Alex Reinert. I'm a law professor at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law, where I teach and conduct research in, among other areas, constitutional law and prisoners' rights. I've also been involved in prisoners' rights litigation for about 15 years now, and I'm currently one of the lawyers in the case involving solitary confinement in the state. So I do not appear as a representative of my home institution. My views reflect my own, and I'm here to testify in opposition to the proposed amendments to the Board of Corrections minimum standards to the extent that they create a new segregation unit, enhanced supervision housing. And I have provided written testimony, which I will depart from for a bit. I want to make one observation. You're voting on whether or not to put people who are presumptively innocent in a cell for 17 hours. This hearing has been going on for almost 5 hours now. We've lost 3 of you. We've lost 3 of you. And you're in a room with contact with people, with stimulation. Okay? So think about that and maybe ask your colleagues to think about that. Now, I'm sure they have things to do. I understand that. I appreciate that. It's a long day. We're all here for a long haul. But consider that as you consider this proposal. I want to say something about process, big and small. Big, this ESH proposal is a moving target. 2 weeks ago, I thought it was one thing. 2 days ago, I thought it was another thing. This morning, when I heard the department speak, it became something else entirely. If you were asked to vote on what was actually proposed, it would not be what was described today, this morning. All right? And that's extremely important from a process perspective. Right? We care about process because we think in the law, process creates better results. We also care about process because it makes people think that there's a legitimacy to what is going on. So that's the big point about process. Let me make some small points about process. The premise upon which the department described the ESH this morning is not reflected in what has been proposed to the board or what the board has proposed. So let's take the first premise, which is that it involves people who are violent. If you look at the ESH, it does not necessarily involve people who are violent. It has extremely vague terms. It allows people to be placed in ESH for conduct upon any of their incarcerations, prior or current, at Rikers. And the process by which people are determined to be placed in ESH is, frankly, rife with the potential for abuse. All right? So that's the first premise that was given to us today, which is just a false premise. The second premise is that there is programming and that this is something like a step-down program. I mean, there was, at one point, someone described it as a step-down program, and then I think when Judge Hamill asked about that, there was a step back from whether it was a step-down program, okay? So if it is a step-down program, that needs to be specified and it needs to be outlined in advance. We cannot, as others have said, rest on the assurances of the department that it will somehow be transformed into a step-down program. Release. There were assertions made about the prospect for release, again, which are not reflected in the proposal. There is no indication as to how anyone will be released from this indefinite detention in this unit. And that relates to the last point, which is it has been described as a non-punitive housing unit. Every single aspect of it, every critical aspect of it, except perhaps out of cell time, is nearly identical, if not worse in some cases, than punitive segregation. So it looks like punitive segregation. The timing of it, on the heels of the board's consideration for a year of making changes to punitive segregation, the hastily sort of enacted proposal, because it's changing every day, suggests that it is meant to be a substitute for segregation. The fact that it is upon the department realizing that it's unconstitutional to continue to use old Bing time suggests that it is a substitute for punitive segregation. So the question is, do you trust the department? And you may or may not trust Commissioner Pont, but that's different from trusting the department. And to make sure that there is a basis and that this ESH will not be abused, you've got to build in measures at the front end and at the back end. And none of that is reflected in this proposal, and that's why I urge you to reject it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much.
Sure, Judge.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Judge.
Of course, of the 1 year, very methodical, deliberative rulemaking we've been doing on solitary confinement. We had an opportunity to meet with you with our former executive, Kathy Potler. Since I know you were limited in time, I would like to hear from you as to what you believe those measures are that we should incorporate in the rules, assuming that what you're saying is true, and it certainly appears to be. The proposal keeps changing during the course of the month that we've heard it.
So I think, first of all, it's not, I don't see the proposal as currently envisioned as based on actual behavior. There's a way in which the department describes it as behavioral in nature. That is, if they show good behavior, then they will be given additional privileges. But the trigger for being placed in the SH is not behavioral. It's not. And so if that's indeed what the department proposes to do, then the department needs to make that clear. And as I read the proposal now, and granted, it's subject to multiple reasonable interpretations. As I read the proposal now, to get into ESH, all someone has to do is provide evidence either that you were infracted for one of these things at any time, no matter how long ago, or a confidential source, or any source that you're an SRG leader, or any of a number of other there's involvement in inmate disturbance, right? What's an inmate disturbance? That can be a political protest. So number one, the categories need to be narrowed, such that if it's really about current behavior that threatens the safety and security of the institution, that's what the determination has to be about. And I don't see that in the current process. Now, I'm going to echo everything everyone has said about what protections need to be given. I'm not going to repeat it. I mean, Professor Zeidman talked about it. Others have talked about it. I put it in my written materials about what kind of procedures should be provided at the front end to make sure that we're putting, if indeed we think that this is a good idea, that you're putting in people who actually pose a threat. And then probably the most important thing, there's the programming aspect and the staffing aspect. Any corrections expert who you talk to will tell you that in order to have an effective intervention, an effective behavioral intervention, there has to be staffing that's not just adequately trained, but that actually is present, that actually is capable of engaging with people in prison or in jail, and has been trained to do so, and is actually committed to doing so. And I'm sure there are people in the department who would be open to that training and who would be committed to doing so. But that's a very granular requirement that, again, if the commissioner keeps telling you they don't need more training, et cetera, we can staff these people with anyone, basically, I'm not sure that the commissioner is incorporating what I think any corrections expert would tell you about how effective interventions are made. And then on the back end, I think there has to be concrete steps that one can take to get out of this unit. And on the back end for you, there have to be ways for you all to know and to get reporting on, et cetera, of what's going on. Now, I certainly don't think you should approve it as it is currently proposed to you. And I think if these changes are made, as someone said earlier, then to be, again, true to the process, then we need to have an opportunity for advocates, et cetera, to process it, and to speak to you about it, and not that it just be wholesale and imposed after you all retire to your own deliberations. Obviously, that's important, but right now we have a proposal that keeps changing literally almost every day, and that's extremely disturbing when you think about how important the protections are that the department is asking you to take away from people who are presumptively innocent.
Thank you, Professor
Sure.
Reinhardt.
You're welcome.
Our next speakers are Christine Japley, Gail Weiner, and Norman Seabrook.
I think it's still good afternoon. My name is Gail Weiner, and I am a private concerned citizen, and also a member of the Jails Action Coalition.
I'm sorry, what coalition?
The Jails Action Coalition.
Thank you.
I have not personally experienced a family member being detained or incarcerated in the New York City jails, but as a member of JAC, I have had the privilege of speaking to many strong, resilient people who have had such experiences. In listening to their personal narratives of pain and heartache, I know that but for the grace of whoever or whatever rolls the dice go I, and I imagine likewise goes those in the position today to make life-defining decisions. I couldn't begin to imagine what it would be like to go through every day or lie in bed at night knowing that a loved one would be locked up in one of the proposed ESHUs, being housed there by virtue of vague and flexible criteria without due process, knowing that they will only be allowed out of their cells at best 7 hours a day, although based on accounts and testimony today, we know that time out of cell that is purported to happen is very often not what happens. I can't imagine as a family member what it would be like to know that a loved one is at the mercy or whim of some correctional staff who are rarely held accountable for their abuse. And to know that the only thing that you could do to help assuage the pain of your, let's say, child, spouse, parent, or friend would be to hold that loved one in your arms for a few minutes and let them know that they are loved, that they are valued, while everything and everyone else around them is telling them that they are not. Yet with the proposed units, this one simple but powerful gesture that you can offer would be denied. I can't imagine what it would be like to be one of the detained or incarcerated, feeling unjustly sentenced to an ESH unit indefinitely, without due process, and perhaps relegated to the unit to an incident at Rikers that you were accused of in the distant past, also without due process. I can't imagine being forced to have all visits with a child through plexiglass and to be minimally let out of the cell to journal. I think that's what Commissioner Pont had mentioned in the press conference, that's what the programming was going to be. I can, however, imagine feeling very angry, frustrated, degraded, and hopeless. Although the mayor stated that the desire of the administration is not to write people off, that is exactly what these units will do. It deprives them of any hope of a positive outcome. It does not take rocket scientists to understand that if you put people, many of whom are detainees, into severe, unjust, inhumane environments, they will likely respond severely and inhumanely. And then we can sit back and say, see how violent they are? But what other recourse do they have? They're not going to be able to earn, the ability to earn privileges by being put in such inhumane environments. By placing a myriad of restrictions in this unit, among them the inability to give and receive hugs from loved ones, is to deny people their humanity. We are social, tactile beings. There are numerous studies that cite the positive effect of human touch. It calms, it soothes, and nurtures. The cold, violent environment of a jail is where a physical, loving touch is even more critical. It is a basic need that would be unjustly and cruelly denied. The responsibility of this board is to ensure that detainees and the incarcerated in the New York City jails are treated humanely. The DOC's proposed ESHUs are inhumane and would continue to define New York City and this board as a party to cruel and unusual punishment. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. The next speaker is Norman Seabrook, the president of the Correctional Officers Benevolent Association, followed by Elias Hussein-Medine, followed by Julia Davis.
Good evening. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You know, I sat here for 5 hours, straight through. I watched some board members leave. I watched you have your lunch. And I kind of wonder how serious this is if no one's going to stay and really listen. It affects the men and women of the New York City Department of Correction and the inmates. And I've said publicly on more than one occasion that inmates deserve to be treated with respect. They're not there to be abused, and neither are correction officers. And I've heard a few people testify before you, but I didn't hear anyone talk about the inmate that slashes another inmate and gives him 90 stitches across his face. What do I do with that inmate that douses another inmate with hot water, scalding him? What do I do with that inmate that every single day extorts another inmate? What do I do with that inmate that rapes another inmate? Now, you call it solitary confinement, some call it punitive segregation. I call it shutting him down so that he doesn't threaten the life of other inmates anymore. Put him in a place where we could supervise him closely. Put him in a place where another inmate's not getting raped tonight. Although it's only one correction officer and we have to go back and forth on each side to find out what's going on. There's 35, 40 inmates on this side, 35, 40 inmates on that side. Who's to watch the inmate when he's getting raped in the bathroom? I don't hear anybody talking about the correction officer that gets his jaw broken by an inmate. Now, yes, we have had correction officers that have crossed the line and they have been punished for it, rightfully so. And it's unacceptable to us, to the union, to the men and women that wear the badge. But at the same time, it is unacceptable for us to sit here and listen to people advocate for those that have raped, murdered, maimed, robbed, done everything they've done to another inmate, to another human individual, and yet nothing's supposed to happen to them. Now, and I'm not saying put the inmate in the cell for 23 hours a day. If you want to let them out, let them out. But there's rules and regulations. If the Justice Department would do their job, and the Mental Health Department would do their job, and the Social Service Department would do their job, you wouldn't have a job because everybody would be doing what they're supposed to do. But we're faced with a problem in the city of New York where even the Board of Correction, you said for yourself, Mr. Cohen, correct? Are you Mr. Cohen? You said for yourself you weren't searched. So from now on, I'm going to ask the Commissioner to institute a policy that all Board of Correction members get searched. Let me just finish. I didn't interrupt. Get searched from top to bottom just like everybody else. If the mayor of the city of New York got to get searched, you got to get searched too. So that policy should cease immediately. And you should be the first one to write a letter requesting that all Board of Correction members be searched. And I'll look for a copy of that letter.
I asked for it today.
Thank you so much, but I'll look for a copy of the written letter. Thank you so much. But anyway, I think that it's important that we do something. Something has to be done. Regardless of whether some people think it's right, wrong, or indifferent, something's got to get done. Because if not, it's only going to get worse. It's only going to become a major problem in the Department of Correction. For 20 years, I've been screaming to the Giuliani administration, to the Bloomberg administration, and now, thankfully, we have the de Blasio administration that's doing something. But it's incumbent upon you and your brothers and sisters that sit on the board with you to make a move that's going to be able to be beneficial to both sides. If you want Joe Pont, the commissioner of the agency, to institute policy and procedure in writing, give us the policy to do the job, and we won't let you down. But we've got to start somewhere. Everything that shines is not gold. We have to do something. There are men and women that are on that island, officers and inmates, depending on what you do. And I would challenge the board. Come sit down with correction officers the same way you sit down with all of these different organizations. And listen to the concerns of the men and women that have urine and feces thrown on them every single tour. Sit down with the men and women who go home with busted lips. Sit down with the men and women who are abused, intimidated by these same gangbangers, by these same individuals. That these same individuals that take out razor blades and slash other inmates. Come sit down, and we have an auditorium on Rikers Island. It's in the George Motion Detention Center. There'll be a ton of officers in there. Hear their grievances as well, because the Board of Correction is challenged by law to represent both sides, not just one. But you have so many members of the Board of Correction that think that they are above everybody else. They think that they're better than everybody else. And because there's no way you're going to tell me that when I signed up that I should have sat here for 5 hours. And I'm sitting like everybody else, and I'm good with that. That's why I didn't say nothing about it. I'm cool. But at the end of the day, treat us the same way that you listen to the JAC, listen to the COBA. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Seabrook, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I know we have common goals, all of us, to have safe, secure, humane jails, and these proposals that DOC proposed that the Board of Correction has adopted are measures meant to address the violence. So in light of your position and your extraordinary experience with the correctional officers, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions that might help certainly me and my colleagues to better understand what is going on at Rikers, so that we can try to address the violence that we know that your staff are absolutely subjected to. There's no doubt about that. So let me just ask a few questions. Do you agree that there is a culture of violence at Rikers?
With inmates, yes.
Okay. And do you have an opinion as to what the root causes of violence at Rikers is?
I think part of the problem is that they don't have anything to do. I think part of the problem is, and I've said this and I went into RNDC, you don't sit a 16-year-old or 17-year-old in a day room watching reruns of Good Times for 5, 6, 7 hours and expect them to be able to function. I think that it's important. Teach them how to be a short order cook. Teach them how to write a resume. Teach them how to tie a tie. Give them something to look forward to when they leave so that they don't have to come back. But we're faced with so much mismanagement in the Department of Corrections. We're in our 9th commissioner in 17 years or 18 years. How's that possible? And then the commissioner comes in with a new policy. And I'm not saying that Joe's policy is wrong or right. I'm just giving you the facts of the amount of people. We've had 11 chiefs of department. We've had 25 assistant chiefs and deputy chiefs. We've had 35 deputy commissioners. You can't function like that. There's no consistency. So the men and women that do the job, the correction officers on the front line, are faced with a new rule and a new regulation every time someone changes policy and procedure by transferring this one or that one. There has to be a little bit more consistency. So, Judge, I would suggest that we get down to the root of it of saying, let's start with, example, mental health. Let's use that for example. If a correction officer is going to work into a mental health unit, then the correction officer should be allowed to put in a resume throughout the whole Department of Correction, and anyone that has prior mental health training and or service should apply for that job and should receive that job above someone who doesn't have that type of training. We need 40 hours worth of training, not 8 hours. You can't expect a correction officer to be able to function productively with 8 hours of training, trained by someone who had 8 hours of training. That doesn't make any sense to me. Give us the training that we need and we can do the job. Give us the resources that we need and we can do the job. But if you don't give them to us, we can't function.
All right, so let me follow up on that, because I do spend a lot of time out at Rikers. I've gotten to speak to a lot of the officers, and Chief Carino's here, and Lord and Becky Scott, and all the great staff out at Rikers that's really bringing about a lot of the reform. What is it? Can you be specific as to what you believe your officers need to be able to be effective in providing the security while reducing the violence?
I think that in providing the security and reducing the violence, you have to have a level of law and order. Let me give you an example. If an inmate slashes another inmate or assaults and slashes a correction officer, he or she should be rearrested, charged with the crime, and face the consequences. But since the inmate doesn't have any punishment, it's not a deterrent for them. So the Bronx District Attorney's Office is not prosecuting them for assaulting other inmates or officers. So what does that mean? I could get away with it. I could punch you in the face, break your jaw, nothing's going to happen to me. The only thing that can happen to me, because the DA's office is not doing any work, is that the Department of Correction wants to put me in punitive segregation, but you can't put me in punitive segregation because we're having this conversation about how you're trying to eliminate punitive segregation. So the inmate is in a win-win situation. Now, not all inmates are bad. You've heard me say this publicly. I have a brother doing 25 years to life. I feel for my brother. I don't want my brother hurt. But at the end of the day, there has to be law and order in jails as well. There has to be consequences. So if the correction officer has the tools, infractions, policy, procedure, has support from the upper management, has support from the district attorney's office, from different parts of the judicial system, then that inmate is going to say, I can't get away with this. There's going to be a problem if I do.
All right, so let me just talk about the other issue. And the data seems to suggest that the officer on inmate violence levels have been dramatically increasing. Do you have any recommendation as to what should be done with those officers?
Judge,
we have the officer on inmate violence?
Judge, I think that they're mixing apples and oranges sometimes. Let me give you an example. If I touch an inmate, it's a use of force. If I put my hands on an inmate, it's classified as a use of force. I didn't do anything but guide the inmate from point A to point B, but I have to write this use of force report. So in order for the prior administration to be able to justify a lot of things that they were doing before they testified before the city council, they added up all these numbers. Now, if you told me that the correction officer had a physical altercation fighting with an inmate, I tell you those numbers are probably going to go down by 2/3. If you tell me that he touched the inmate, then the numbers are probably going to even go higher, because you're not, as soon as you put your hands on them. So what I would suggest, and what I've suggested to the correction officers, and I've said this publicly, use whatever force is necessary to terminate the threat. I'm not talking about yelling and screaming back and forth. I'm talking about to prevent this inmate from hurting himself, another inmate, or yourself, or someone else. Use whatever. Once the force is over, it's over. It's just like I've heard people testify about they have to kiss their loved one through the bars on the visit floor. We don't have bars on Rikers Island on the visit floor. We don't have that. That doesn't exist. So people are being disingenuous. That's not fair. And as far as individuals that are having to have booth visits as opposed to physical visits, let's look at the history of, did that person assault that visitor the last time that they were here, and that's why we're protecting the visitor? Did that person receive contraband from that visitor the last time we were here, and that's why we've got them separated? Is there a serious threat level to do that? But people are being disingenuous, and it's not fair. It's not fair to destroy the integrity of a correction officer or an inmate when it's not true. And I've said it, and I'll say it again. Correction officers that don't do what they're supposed to do, there is no room for them to wear this badge. But damn, give us a break too. Come sit down and listen to what we've got to go through. Come sit down and find out that we are under tremendous amount of stress, totally understaffed, and then the people that's supposed to be with the Board of Corrections, they walk around like they're better than us. They don't want to talk to us. And that's a shame, because we employ them as well. But they won't do that for us, Judge. I'm telling you they won't do that for us. And I'm telling you my name wasn't the last one on this list. But it's all good. I like that type of stuff, because it gives me the opportunity to listen and thank that man upstairs for the blessings that he gives me. You see, hold on, one more second, because the judge is right. What do we do about it now? Do we turn around and just make believe it doesn't exist? Is there a culture of violence that we have to attack? Let's take a look at it. Let's ask the Department of Corrections to give you the numbers on whether or not you touched the inmate or whether or not you had a physical altercation with the inmate. You'll see the numbers go down. I understand that the Southern District report from the federal courts, they're stepping in, the federal U.S. attorney to step in and do what it is that they have to do. And you know what? If it's going to make the department, the city of New York, and everybody else more accountable, welcome. Let's go. But at the end of the day, y'all got to do your job too.
Bobby, it's Cheever.
Just Norman, brother.
Bobby, Norman. So you've been, I think 20 years. You've been president for 20 years.
Yes, sir.
So in 1994, there were 1,037 slashings in the Department of Corrections, and in this year there have been 90 so far, which is too many. It's more than last year when they were 73. It's more than the year before when they were 71. But the numbers through the 90s were in the 1,000, 500, 400 range, and then they went down. I can't show this. It's a graph. I know you're familiar.
Yes, sir.
With the data. I wonder if you could help me understand, based on your experience, why the numbers were so high before, why they came down dramatically through into the 21st century, and then they've gone up over the past 5 or 6 years. But the numbers were 7, 8, 9 times the size they are now.
In those administrations you're talking about, I think the Carrick administration is one of them in there. The Horn administration, the Doris Shuro administration is the one in there. Carrick did a lot of searches. Every time you turn around, we were searching, keeping inmates safe. So I give Bernie his props. We were keeping inmates safe. Dora, on the other hand, Dr. Doris Shuro, on the other hand, hired 100 psychoanalysts to tell her, no, it doesn't work like that. And the numbers started to go north. Use of force went up because of the way that you calculated the use of force. You didn't calculate it by real assaults. There are some assaults that take place, but it's defense of another inmate or themselves or the correction officer. So you have the style of two different commissioners, and that's what would make the numbers change.
The A and B use of force, which have to do with injuries that you can objectively see, those numbers have also increased, haven't they?
Yes, they have, and it's the reporting that makes all of that take place. You know, it's almost like, what do you want to report? Who's going to look at the report? It's almost like you have to answer to somebody. Someone answers to the mayor of the city of New York, to the city council, to, you know, Elizabeth Crowley, who is chairman of fire correction. And you want your numbers to look right. But at the same time, you want to keep your people safe. Look, our job is care, custody, and control. We will maintain that. We will keep inmates safe. But we ask that you help keep us safe, too.
Actually, I have a follow-up question. Yes, you know, in terms of the lockout, you know, generally our rule is that inmates have to be locked up 14 hours a day. And we understand that part of the proposal for the enhanced supervision is to lock out only 7 hours a day. And when inquiring about that, it's because there would be 50 inmates, and they're the most dangerous inmates at Rikers. So to make it a safer environment, only allow 25 out at one time. Would you agree with me? The way to make it the most safe then would be to have separate units where there's only 25 inmates per unit with a higher staffing of officer to inmate where they could be locked out.
That's it right there.
More amount of time with programming.
That's it right there. Give us the amount of staff that we need, and you can lock all 50 of them out. But give us the staff members that we need. Judge, when I started this job in 1985, I started in what was then called ARDC, which is now RNDC. I worked in the worst housing area in the jail. It was called 4 Lower. People used to look at their name on the schedule and bang in and not want to come to work for the whole week because they had the 4 building. Those were the worst of the worst. All adolescents. Released from the Bing. But when you have steady officers, when you have steady consistency, when you have your policies in place for young men to understand where you're coming from, and with the staff that you have to have and the help that you need from the managers in unit management or wherever it is that you want to call it, you're going to get the job done. You're going to have some kinks in the beginning, but at the end of the day, you're going to get the job done. Give us the staffing that we need. Hold not only the department, but the city and everybody else accountable for what's supposed to take place. And we will prove to you that correction officers are the best damn correction officers in the world. And we won't be targeted by the 5 in the last 5 years, 6 years that have been on the front page of the paper for doing something wrong. Let's not talk about that. That's 5. Let's talk about the thousands that do what they're supposed to every single day. Right there, somewhere right now, there's 20 minutes after 2 and somebody's not going home because they're getting stuck for another 8 hours. But we don't get the board to come out there and say, officer, what's the problem? Officer, how's your bathroom working? Officer, you got heat and hot water in this area? Officer, you have this? We don't have that. They walk past us like we don't even exist. And then some of them that do walk around, they think that they, prima donnas. I get it, it's cool. But treat us the same way. Respect us the same way. And fight for us the same way. You want to fight for an inmate. And I don't have a problem with inmates because you meet the same people on the way up as you can meet on the way down. And I've seen inmates on the street that have offered to buy me a drink. So I can't be that bad.
I've just got one follow-up question. I know when I have met with the various union leadership and members of COBA and all, what we hear frequently, and certainly what I've heard in my rulemaking committee over the last year, is that you all are not really trained and adept at dealing with mentally ill, and that so many of our inmates are mentally ill. Would you agree with me in light of that with the enhanced supervision unit, that mentally ill inmates should not be placed in there?
I'm not saying, that takes me back to where I said that Rikers Island is a new dumping ground for the city of New York. We have the mentally ill, we have the innocent, we have the guilty. Okay, we have them all. And the homeless. But at the end of the day, if the Department of Mental Health did their job and put individuals that have mental health issues in proper housing before they come to jail, as opposed to dumping them there, we wouldn't be talking about this. So to answer your question even further, give us the training that we need and change the environment like Joe Pont wants to do, and let's give it a shot. The only thing that could happen here is we go back to where we started from. Put something on it and say, okay, Joe, you got a year, 18 months. I don't know what it is. 2 years. I don't know what you're going to come up with. Either way, correctional officers have to do the job anyway. So it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter. You could either do it or not do it. At the end of the day, we still got to do it. You're not going here to do it. We got to do it. So let's do it and do it together. Let's take it and say, you know what? Let's put this policy in place that he wants and hold his feet to the fire and say, if it's not done in 16 months, 18 months, whatever it is, we're going to scratch it. But give us the training. Let a correctional officer go learn for 40 hours from a designated, certified mental health instructor that gives them a piece of paper like a diploma, whatever you want to call it, that's going to be accredited so that when we go to court and the judge says, well, what did you do? We can't say we learned 8 hours of training from the jiu-jitsu instructor at the academy. That don't work. Give us the training that we need and we'll get the job done.
Thank you, Mr. Seabrook.
Thank you. Have a great holiday. God bless you and your family. Thank you.
The next speaker is, I ask people to hold their applause. The next speaker is Elias Hussein, followed by Julian Davis, followed by Dr. Siegel. Elias. Elias? Thank you. Yes. The next speaker is Julia Davis. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Julia Davis, and I'm a staff attorney with Children's Rights. Thank you for your endurance this afternoon. Children's Rights is a national advocate for youth that are in child welfare systems, and our experience with adolescents and young adults brings us in contact with the juvenile and the adult correction systems. Our clients are disproportionately represented in these settings. According to press reports, 48% of the 5,400 children arrested and detained in 2010 in New York City had previous or current foster care involvement, including more than 300 youth who were living in foster care at the time of their arrest. This is really just an example, and we submitted a more detailed report yesterday to the board that gives a little bit more context for the overlap in the foster care community and among young people, and their shared experience of trauma and their need for developmentally appropriate services once they come into custody of the state. We are very concerned about the conditions facing older youth at Rikers Island, including the teenagers and the young adults up to age 25. These young people are extremely vulnerable, as you've heard today, especially those who've lacked the stability of a permanent family. For more than a generation, national and state child welfare policy has recognized that young people like those in foster care and in criminal justice systems require ongoing supports and services through early adulthood. It doesn't end at 17 or 18. This understanding drives our federal policy in child welfare that provides health care services, life skills, support for education and training, case management services for young people through their mid-20s. Children's Rights submitted some more information about this yesterday. The key point is this: because youth development does not end at age 18, and we know this from biology, neuroscience, social science, and this context lets us know that the pathways established during adolescence and young adulthood are critically important to brain development. Experiences during this period and among the populations at Rikers within this age group shape their future lives as older adults. So with this in mind, we want to tell you this. Solitary confinement, the punitive segregation policy, is harmful to older youth up to 25. You've heard that from other colleagues today. We joined the Legal Aid Society, we joined the New York City Jails Action Coalition, and the New York Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights in urging the board to protect young people 18 to 25 as it does for those who are 16 and 17. Youth, especially the traumatized youth that are within these systems, must be free from further trauma, and punitive segregation does the opposite. It inflicts trauma. Solitary confinement, punishment, is an inappropriate discipline strategy for anyone under 25. We also are concerned about the supervision, the enhanced supervision housing as currently proposed, that this would limit young people's access to visitation, disrupt participation in programming, and that includes educational services. Institutionalized youth, and we know this from our child welfare work, need more contact with trusted adults, more contact with services, not less. So ESH is inconsistent with the research that we know works from serving older youth in child welfare. Finally, we've heard a lot about training today, and I just want to reinforce the point that all adults that are working with young people up to age 25 within these settings has to understand the developmental context that these young people operate within. Professor Yaroshevsky's report really opens the door to some excellent models and essential pieces of information to drive your rulemaking to serve this population, and gives you some examples of other models that have worked in other parts of the country. I hope that you will review it closely.
Thank you.
Thank you.